Before her first marriage, but when she was first incarcerated, Susan Atkins was engaged in 1976 to a man named Lori White. The two had originally met on December 31st, 1968, where she spent 4 days at his house in Topanga Canyon. White was a student at the University of Los Angeles at the time. Initially, Susan wanted White to come to the ranch with her, but he declined, saying that he was interested in her only. Though Lori White and Susan fell in love, he met another woman and moved with her to Hawaii. In October 1978, Susan was engaged again, this time to a man named John Burrell. He had started writing her in 1976, to which they became very close. Susan broke off the engagement, though, stating that she didn't feel ready for marriage at the time, and it wasn't fair for Burrell to wait a lifetime for her to get out. In 1979, Susan was engaged once again to a man named Michael Holbrook. It was not until after the engagement that she found out he was very unstable. She broke off all contact with him and she became afraid of him. Despite her going no contact, Holbrook was persistent and kept attempting to contact her. Susan ended up having to ask the institution she was in to stop taking his mail and phone calls. After her hasty and failed marriage to Donald Lee Lazier in 1981, Susan Atkins was single once again. In 1985, James Whitehouse wrote a letter to Susan after having read Helter Skelter and Susan's book, Child of Satan, Child of God. At this point in time, Susan had converted to Roman Catholicism, and the two connected over this point, as James Whitehouse came from a Roman Catholic family. Susan hadn't responded to many letters during this time period for about 5 years, but she was impressed with his letter and responded back. The two developed a friendship, and he started visiting her regularly. In an interview, James stated that he didn't remember what he told her, but he remembered praying before sending the letter. He said, "God, if this isn't a good idea, then don't let her get it." At the time, Whitehouse had felt lost and was into drug usage. When he was 20 years old, he was 6 feet tall and 113 pounds. He stated, "I was eating dinner one day in the living room with a gun on my lap. I realized that people don't just wake up one morning and decide to run amok. People make a bad choice and something goes wrong, then they make another bad choice, and eventually they end up in a situation where there are no longer any right answers." While Whitehouse knew that contacting Atkins was extreme, he stated that at that age, everything seems dramatic. He had told her in his letters that he was living with a bunch of people and wanted to get his life together. He had been 22 years old at the time and was the oldest person in the entire place, having a hard time holding it all together. Atkins apparently encouraged him to get out of there, and after he sent his letter, they wrote monthly to one another. Whitehouse moved to North Hollywood and started playing in metal bands, having even opened for Megadeth once. He was about an hour from the prison that Susan was incarcerated at and visited her there. In 1987, his band got caught with drugs and he spent 2 days in jail. Afterwards, he got an invitation from his grandmother that he could live in the guest room of her trailer in San Juan Capistrano if he went back to school. Whitehouse enrolled at Golden West College, and after one semester, he had a 3.75 GPA. After that semester, he realized that he was in love with Susan Atkins. James stated that his feeling for her crept up on him as he realized how sorry she was for the murders and how little the world knew about the penance she did. While in prison, Susan participated in multiple programs that received commendations in her parole hearing. Whitehouse apparently asked her 4 times to marry him, with her asking him if he lost his mind at first. On December 7th, 1987, the two got married at the prison administration building. James did not tell his parents that he was married until 3 months later. His parents were concerned at first, his father first saying, "Nobody can change that much. You can't do something that horrible and then change into a wonderful person." But over time, apparently the Whitehouse family came to like. In 1989, Susan had a parole hearing of which a commissioner of the Board of Prison Terms stated, "And he's willing to wait for you forever?" in hearing that she had gotten married. In this hearing, she merely stated her husband was working on a degree in engineering, though truthfully, he had been accepted into Harvard at the time. This same year, the two had conjugal visits every 90 days for 3 days on prison grounds. They had 14 visits total. James graduated from the University of Irvine as an honor student. Once accepted into Harvard, he lived in a trailer alone in Orange County, spending 9 months out of the year at the university. He would visit her on holidays, and during the summer he'd visit twice a week. In 1997, he graduated from Harvard with his Juris Doctorate in Constitutional Law as cum laude. 6 months after his graduation, James was admitted to the bar. Despite all of the potential job opportunities, he was prepared for Susan's next parole hearing. This parole hearing was for December of 2000, of which she was denied. Interestingly, the prison psychiatrists found her to be a far different person, though she had the tendency to minimize her role in the murders. After the 2000 denial, James Whitehouse hired Eric Lampel, who was a trial attorney. They filed a writ of habeas corpus in the Superior Court, alleging that there were 42 instances that the parole board had deliberately ignored the law and parole rules that kept Susan Atkins incarcerated. While in prison, Susan allegedly partook in multiple programs that helped with other inmates. In 2003, the two lawyers filed a second suit, alleging that the prison board members were part of a concerted effort to keep Susan in prison, regardless of the evidence, and that they should be held personally liable for inflicting what amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Despite going to the media and gaining supporters, the courts ruled that the crimes alone were enough to justify a denial. The appeals were denied, and in 2005, Susan Atkins was denied parole again, stating that her crimes were too heinous. In 2008, Susan developed brain cancer and had to be moved to the Central California Women's Facility. This was a 7-hour drive that James always made, which the visiting hours were only twice a week. Initially, Susan's prognosis was that she'd only have a few months to live, but she survived long enough to make a 21st wedding anniversary with James. At some point, Susan's leg had to be amputated, and she had had difficulty speaking from March of 2008.
She's paralyzed about 85% of her body. She can nod her head, she can look left and right. She has limited use of her left arm.
Now virtually alone and dependent on her devoted husband, James Whitehouse, who drives 1,000 miles a week to see her, Atkins is asking that her life sentence be cut short so she can die at home, rather than in the California prison system where she's been for 39 years, denied parole repeatedly, despite expressions of deep regret to her victims and their loved ones.
She's expressed her remorse and grief at every single one of her 17 other parole hearings going back to 1972.
In 2002, Diane Sawyer met her in prison while Atkins was working with other women who had life sentences. She told Diane she's a changed woman.
I'm not the same person that I was when I came in here.
Do you expect to be out someday?
I would like to be out someday.
Still clinging to that hope, Atkins and her family will again appear before a parole board this September to make their plea official. But the families of the Manson victims and their advocates dismiss economics as a good reason for early release.
The very release of a killer like that sends a message to people that this life sentence doesn't mean a life sentence. She needs to, in grace and dignity, finish her sentence.
On September 2nd, 2009, Atkins had been denied parole for the last time, despite contentions that her medical care cost over $800,000 to the U.S. taxpayer. Apparently, Vince Bugliosi even supported her release to save the state money, as there was over $300,000 spent just to guard her hospital room. On September 24, 2009, Atkins died at the Central California Women's Facility. Her death was listed as natural causes, and her last words whispered were "Amen." Susan's body was cremated, and her ashes were given to her husband, James. After her death, James stated that he didn't know what to do with himself. "I didn't have any plans for the future that didn't include Susan." His home still has all of her things, even still hanging the picture she drew. Interestingly, Whitehouse can be found on LinkedIn and his website. His LinkedIn profile is rather bare and skims over the fact that he pursued law because of someone from the Manson case. His website lightly touches on the fact that his wife was in prison, though it does not mention her name. In the top header that features his picture, a portrait of Susan can be seen in the background. Beyond this, there does not seem to be much more about Whitehouse's personal or work life, and I still don't know if he practices law.